Father Donald, please. I beg you, don't do this to me. Father, please! She screamed out. My name is Judith, and if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I was raised in the church. Not just any church, a strict, deeply Catholic home where missing Mass was practically a sin, and church activities were more important than anything else. In my family, faith wasn't just something we practiced, it was a way of life. My parents weren't just Sunday Catholics. No, they were everyday Catholics. Morning Mass, evening rosary, Bible studies, choir rehearsals. If there was a church event, we were there. No excuses. I grew up knowing all the prayers by heart. The Hail Mary, the Our Father, the Apostles' Creed. I could recite them in my sleep. I knew when to kneel, when to stand, when to respond during Mass. It was second nature to me, and honestly, I didn't mind. I loved the church. It felt like home. I became an altar server when I was 10, and by the time I turned 15, I wasn't just any altar server, I was the vice president. That meant I wasn't just serving at Mass. I was leading the younger ones, making sure they were prepared, helping them understand the importance of what we were doing. I took it seriously, because to me, being an altar server wasn't just about carrying the cross or ringing the bells during consecration. It was about being close to God. And I wasn't alone in that. There was Frank. Frank was my closest friend in church. We had been serving together for as long as I could remember, and everyone knew us as a pair. If you saw me, you saw Frank. If I wasn't at Mass, people would ask him where I was. If he missed a meeting, they'd ask me. That's just how it was. He was the one person I could always count on. Frank had this way of making everything feel okay. He was the kind of friend who would remind me to pray when I was struggling, who would make me laugh when I was tired, who would always tell me, "Judith, keep your eyes on God. He never fails." I believed that. I needed to believe that. Because in church I felt safe. It was the one place where nothing bad could happen. Or at least, that's what I thought. Then there was Father Donald. He wasn't officially a priest yet, just a seminarian, a few months away from being ordained. But everyone already treated him like one. People loved him. He was the kind of man that made you feel like he was closer to God than the rest of us. He was always praying, always reading his Bible, always speaking so gently, so calmly. If you had a problem, he was the person you went to. "Father, I need prayers for my family. Father, I'm struggling in school. Father, I want to be a better Christian." And he would always smile and say, "Let's pray together." It was hard not to admire him. Even I did. I mean, why wouldn't I? A man who loved God that much, who was so kind, so patient, so holy. Of course I respected him. Of course I trusted him. We all did. And that's what made everything so much worse. I still remember the day he asked me, "Judith, can you help me clean my room?" It sounded so normal. Of course I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? He was a priest, or at least about to be one. And me? I was an altar server. Helping out was what I did. So I smiled and said, "Yes, Father." That was my first mistake. I walked into his room and everything seemed fine at first. The place was neat. Too neat, actually. It didn't even look like it needed cleaning. But I didn't question it. I just grabbed a cloth and started wiping down the table. And that's when I felt it. A hand. On my waist. I froze. For a second I thought, no, I must be imagining it. Maybe he was just reaching for something. Maybe it was an accident. But then his fingers pressed into my side, slow and deliberate. I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Father?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his hand linger for just a second longer before pulling away like nothing had happened. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. He was smiling. "You're such a good girl, Judith. Always so helpful." I wanted to believe I had imagined it, I wanted to believe that it was nothing, so I forced a small, nervous laugh and stepped away. "Thank you, Father." Then I left. I didn't run. I didn't say anything. I just left. But my body was shaking, and I didn't know why. I avoided him after that. It wasn't obvious. I still saw him in church, still greeted him, still acted normal. But I made sure never to be alone with him. Not if I could help it. But then, a few weeks later, it happened again. I don't even remember how I ended up alone with him that time. Maybe I had let my guard down. Maybe I had convinced myself that I was overreacting. But there I was. And there he was. "Judith," he said softly, standing too close to me. I tried to step back, but he caught my wrist gently, almost like he was being careful. "Do you know how beautiful you are?" I felt something cold crawl up my spine. "Father, I should go," I mumbled, trying to pull away, but he didn't let go. Instead, he raised his other hand and touched my face. I froze. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered. I wasn't just afraid. I was terrified. And then he leaned in. I felt his breath on my skin, the weight of what was happening crashing down on me all at once. "No!" I yanked my hand away and stumbled back. His eyes darkened for just a second, then the smile returned. "You're still young," he murmured. "But don't worry. Just 3 years from now, you'll be old enough without fear." I stared at him. I heard what he said. I understood the words, but I didn't want to believe them. I didn't want to believe what he was telling me. So I shook my head, turned, and left. Again. This time my legs felt like lead. This time my hands were shaking even harder. This time I knew. And I never should have gone back. I should have known better. I should have trusted my instincts. Something had been telling me to stay away from Father Donald, to keep my distance, to never be alone with him again. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that a man of God, someone respected, someone loved, someone who was supposed to guide us, could be capable of something evil. So, I convinced myself that maybe I had been wrong. Maybe that touch, that attempted kiss, it wasn't what I thought. Maybe he had just made a mistake. Maybe he wasn't truly dangerous, but deep down, I knew. That's why I took my friend with me that day. I didn't want to go alone. I didn't tell her why, of course. How could I? I just casually asked if she wanted to come with me to church, and she said yes. Just like that. No questions, no hesitation. I felt safer knowing she'd be there. When we arrived, everything felt normal at first. The usual sounds of people moving around, the quiet hum of prayers in the background. I even started to relax a little. Then he saw me. "Judith," Father Donald said, smiling in that same way that made my skin crawl. "You finally came." I forced a smile. "Yes, Father." His eyes flicked to my friend. "And who is this?" She introduced herself cheerfully, completely unaware of the tension tightening my chest. "Ah, welcome," he said warmly. Then he looked at me. "You both must be thirsty. Let me get you something to drink." I didn't like the way he said it. Something about it made my stomach twist. "Oh, we're fine, Father," I said quickly, but my friend, completely unaware of my unease, laughed. "Actually, I'd love a drink." I hesitated. Before I could say anything, he disappeared into the next room. A moment later, he returned with 2 bottles of soft drinks. One was cold, the other wasn't. He handed me the cold one. I didn't even realize. "Do you mind if we switch? I really prefer the cold one," my friend asked casually. "Of course," I said, handing it to her. Just like that. I had no idea I had just saved myself. At first, nothing seemed strange. We sat, sipped our drinks, chatted about random things, but then... "I feel weird," my friend murmured, blinking slowly. I turned to her, concerned. "What do you mean?" She swayed a little. "I don't know, just tired." And then, right in front of me, she closed her eyes and slumped over. My heart stopped. "Hey, wake up," I said, shaking her gently. Nothing. Panic rushed through me. "Father, something is wrong," I said, turning to him. He was watching us carefully, too carefully. Then, as if nothing was strange, he said, She must just be tired. Don't worry. I swallowed hard. Are you sure? Of course, he said smoothly. Then he looked at me. Actually, Judith, can you do me a favor? I need something from the market. Could you go get it for me? I frowned. But my friend, she'll be fine, he interrupted too quickly. Just let her rest, it's nothing serious. Something was wrong. I felt it. But I had no reason to say no. I didn't want to seem rude. I didn't want to act like I suspected anything. So I nodded. Okay. I took the money and left. But as I walked toward the market, something in my gut twisted. Why had he asked me to go? Why right now? Why did my friend fall asleep so fast? I stopped walking. Cold fear crawled up my spine. I turned and ran. I didn't even think about it. I just ran back to the church as fast as my legs could carry me. My heart was pounding, my breath was sharp and shallow. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I knew I couldn't leave her alone. I burst into the room. My friend was still there, still asleep. Father Donald was sitting calmly, flipping through his Bible like nothing had happened. He looked up at me, raising an eyebrow. Oh, you're back so soon? I didn't answer. I rushed to my friend and shook her harder this time. Wake up. Please, wake up. She stirred, groggy. What happened? She mumbled. You fell asleep, I said, my voice shaking. She rubbed her eyes. I feel dizzy. I turned and looked at Father Donald. He was watching me, watching us. She must have been really tired, he said, standing up. It happens. I felt sick. Something had happened. Or maybe it was going to happen. But he had sent me away. And now I was back before he expected me to be. I grabbed my friend's hand. We need to go. She was still drowsy, still slow, but she nodded. We left quickly, not looking back. The entire way home, my mind raced. Had I just left my friend in danger? Had something happened while I was gone? I wanted to ask her, but I was too afraid of the answer. Because if she said yes, if she told me something had happened, then I would have to accept the truth. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. I knew something was wrong the moment he asked me. It was just another regular day at church, or at least it was supposed to be. I was trying to focus on my responsibilities, arranging things for the younger altar servers, making sure everything was in order for Sunday Mass. That's when the president of the altar servers, the leader of both the boys and girls, called me aside. Judith, I need you to do something. I looked up at him, already feeling a sense of unease creeping into my chest. What is it? I asked. Father Donald needs his room cleaned. I want you to go. Immediately, my stomach tightened. His room? Again? I had been avoiding that place ever since the last time. Ever since the weird comments, the inappropriate touches, the way he looked at me in a way that made my skin crawl. I had been ignoring his calls, dodging him after Mass, making sure I was never alone near him. And now, here I was, being sent back into his space. I wanted to say no. I should have said no. But how could I? The altar server's president was older than me, respected by everyone, and if I refused, I knew it would raise questions. Besides, he was coming with me, right? I wouldn't be alone. That made it safer. At least, that's what I told myself. So I nodded. Okay. I followed him down the corridor, my heart thudding with every step. I kept telling myself that I was just overthinking, that maybe Father Donald had changed, that maybe I had misunderstood him all along. After all, he was a man of God. He couldn't do anything truly bad. Right? When we reached his door, the president knocked once, then pushed it open. Father Donald was inside, sitting at his desk, flipping through his Bible. He looked up when we entered, his face calm, unreadable. Good afternoon, Father, the president greeted. Afternoon, Father Donald responded, his eyes flickering toward me. I lowered my gaze, focusing on the floor. I didn't want to be here. I just wanted to get this over with. The president turned to me. Go ahead and clean up. I'll be back soon. Wait, What? I snapped my head up, my stomach twisting. You're leaving, I blurted before I could stop myself. Yes, he said casually. I need to check something at the parish office. I won't take long. But he did take long, because he never came back. The door clicked shut behind him and suddenly I was alone. With him. With Father Donald. I swallowed hard, gripping the broom so tightly my fingers ached. Maybe it was fine. Maybe nothing would happen. Maybe. I forced myself to move, pretending to clean, focusing on the tiny particles of dust on the floor. Anything to distract myself. But then, I heard movement behind me, slow, deliberate. I stiffened, my breath catching. Judith. His voice was soft, but there was something in it that made my skin prickle. I didn't turn around. Judith, look at me. I clenched my jaw. Just finish and leave. Just finish and leave. Then, I heard it. The door. Click. I turned around just in time to see him locking it. My heart plummeted. Father, what are you doing? My voice was shaking barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward me. Slow, steady, like a predator that already knew its prey couldn't escape. Please, I said, my voice cracking. Don't. He smiled, but there was nothing kind about it. Why are you acting like this? He asked. You're a beautiful girl, Judith. Don't be afraid. I took a step back, then another, but the room wasn't big enough. There was nowhere to go. Please, I repeated, my back hitting the wall. I don't want to do this. His eyes darkened. It's okay, he whispered. Just relax. Then, before I could react, he grabbed my wrist. I gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. Let me go. I twisted, fought, but he was stronger, much stronger. I opened my mouth to scream, but his hand shot up, covering it. No one will hear you, he murmured. I struggled harder, thrashing, kicking, trying to break free, but it didn't matter. Because he overpowered me. Because he took what he wanted. Because no matter how loud I screamed in my head, the walls of that room swallowed my voice whole. When it was over, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Everything hurt. My body, my soul, my faith. I lay there numb as he stood up, straightening his clothes like nothing had happened. Then, he knelt, in front of me, like he was praying, like he was the one in pain. Judith, please, he whispered, his voice thick with something that sounded like desperation. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I wanted to laugh, or cry, or scream, but I did nothing. Take this. He reached into his pocket, pulling out some money. Buy pills. No one has to know. Please. I stared at the money in his hand, bile rising in my throat. Money. He thought this could be fixed with money. Like I was some problem that needed covering up. I felt something inside me break. Without a word, I pushed myself up, my entire body trembling. My legs felt weak, unsteady. The pain between them was unbearable, but I forced myself to move. I had to get out. I had to leave. I staggered toward the door, my fingers fumbling with the lock. Somehow I managed to open it. Somehow I forced myself to step outside. The world outside was the same. The sun was still shining. People were still laughing. The church was still standing, untouched. But I was not the same. I was ruined. I stumbled home in silence, my heart pounding, my throat tight. I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to scream it to the whole world. But who would believe me? Who would believe that man of God, the one everyone adored, the one who prayed more than anyone else, the one who was about to become a priest, would do something like this? No one. Absolutely no one. 5, I wanted to pretend it never happened. I wanted to wake up and convince myself it was just a nightmare. But nightmares don't leave you feeling hollow. They don't make you flinch at every touch. They don't make you afraid of your own shadow. For days I walked around in a fog, moving but not really living. I woke up, dressed up, went to church, attended mass, smiled when I was supposed to, nodded when people spoke to me, but inside, I was dying. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, felt him, heard him. And every time my phone rang, my chest squeezed so tight I could barely breathe. It was always him. Father Donald, calling, texting, begging. Judith, please talk to me. We need to sort this out. I'm sorry I never meant to hurt you. I deleted every message, ignored every call, but he never stopped. I started avoiding places where I might run into him. I changed my usual routes, left church as soon as Mass ended, never stayed back for altar meetings. People noticed. Judith, what's wrong? You've been so quiet lately. Are you sick? I forced a smile every time, nodding, lying, saying I was just tired. Tired? God, if only they knew. But how could I tell them? Who would believe me? Who would believe that Father Donald, the same priest everyone respected, the man everyone looked up to, the man people whispered was too holy for this world, had destroyed me? No one. Absolutely no one. So I kept quiet, and I suffered alone. At first, I didn't think much of it. The tiredness, the dizziness, the way my stomach felt heavy in the mornings. It was stress, I told myself. Too much thinking, too much worrying. That's all it was. Then my appetite changed. Food that I used to love suddenly made me want to throw up. The smell of fried eggs? Disgusting. My mother's spicy jollof rice? Couldn't even stand it. I ignored it. Until my period didn't come. That's when the panic started. It wasn't late. Not yet. Just a day or two. It would come. It had to come. Except it didn't. 1 day turned into 3. 3 turned into a week. A week turned into 2. I still told myself it was fine. My cycle wasn't always regular. Maybe stress had delayed it. Maybe if I just relaxed, it would come. But deep down, I knew. I just didn't want to believe it. I refused to believe it. Until the morning I woke up, ran to the bathroom, and threw up so violently my mother knocked on the door in alarm. Judith, are you okay? I wiped my mouth, forcing my voice to sound normal. Yes, Mummy, I think I ate something bad. Lies. More lies. I couldn't face the truth. Not yet. I bought the test in secret. I couldn't risk buying it from a pharmacy near home, so I took a bus to another town. My hands were shaking when I paid the woman behind the counter. I avoided her eyes, stuffed the test into my bag, and rushed out before anyone could see me. The whole way home, my heart pounded. I told myself it would be negative, that I was panicking for no reason. But when I locked myself in the bathroom and saw those 2 pink lines staring back at me, shattered. Number no, 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 no. I shook the test, as if that would change the result. I took another one, same result. I took a third, same. I couldn't breathe. I gripped the sink, my legs trembling, my whole body breaking down. I was pregnant. And I knew exactly who was responsible. Tears blurred my vision. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But it was. I slid to the floor, pressing my hands to my stomach, my mind screaming. What was I supposed to do? Who could I tell? Who would believe me? No one. No one. No one. I cried until my chest ached, until there were no more tears left, until I had nothing but emptiness inside me. I didn't go to church the next day. I couldn't. I couldn't even look at that building anymore without wanting to throw up. I don't know how I made it through the next few days. Everything felt like a blur. I moved through life like a ghost, not speaking, not eating, just existing. I kept thinking, this is it. My life is over. And then, one evening I broke. Frank found me sitting outside the church, staring at nothing. Judith? I flinched. I hadn't even heard him walk up. What's wrong? His voice was gentle, concerned. I opened my mouth, ready to say nothing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, my throat tightened, and before I knew it, tears spilled down my face. Frank panicked. Judith, talk to me. What's happening? I shook my head, pressing my hands to my face, trying to hold it in, but it was useless. The dam had broken. I can't, I whispered. You can't what? I can't do this anymore. Frank sat down beside me, lowering his voice. What happened? I hesitated. I had told no one. No one. But suddenly, in that moment, with Frank looking at me like that, like he genuinely cared, like he saw me, it all came pouring out. He hurt me, I choked out. And now I couldn't even say it. Frank's eyes darkened. Who? Who hurt you? I struggled to breathe. Father Donald. His entire body went still. What? He forced me, I whispered, my voice breaking. And now I sucked in a shaky breath, then finally forced the words out. I'm pregnant. Silence. Frank just stared at me, and then, oh my God. I covered my face, shaking with silent sobs. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, finally, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, "We have to do something." Frank stared at me like I had just told him the world was ending, and maybe, for me, it was. "Judith, are you serious?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, his hands clenched into fists. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to wake himself up from a nightmare. No, this can't be real. This isn't happening." I swallowed hard. "It is. He did this to you?" His voice cracked with anger. Tears welled in my eyes again. I looked away, ashamed. Yes. Silence. The kind that felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, without warning, Frank jumped to his feet. His face was twisted with rage. His chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. I had never seen him this angry before. "I swear to God, I will kill him." "Frank, no!" I grabbed his arm before he could storm off. My hands were shaking. "You can't. Why not?" He was breathing heavily, his entire body trembling with fury. "He can't just get away with this. He ruined your life, Judith. His voice broke. I could see it in his eyes. The helplessness, the pain, the same feelings drowning me. I tightened my grip on his arm. "Frank, please." He looked down at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. But slowly, he sat back down, rubbing his face with both hands. For a long time, he didn't speak. Neither did I. We just sat there in silence, surrounded by the weight of everything. After what felt like forever, he finally whispered, "What are you going to do?" I let out a shuddering breath. I don't know. How was I supposed to know? I was 15, pregnant, and the father was a priest. I couldn't tell my parents. They would never believe me. The church, they worshipped him. The community, they would call me a liar. I was trapped, absolutely trapped. Frank clenched his fists again. "We have to do something. We can't just let this happen." "Like what?" I whispered. "Tell people. Who will believe me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer, because we both knew the truth. No one would take my side. Father Donald was too loved, too respected, too holy. And me? I was just a girl who would be called a liar, a sinner, a temptation. Frank let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is so messed up. He's supposed to be a man of God." I wiped my tears. That doesn't mean anything. Not anymore. I had seen the devil and he wore a white collar. Frank took a deep breath, then turned to me. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "Judith." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "What?" He hesitated. Then, in a voice so low I almost didn't hear him, he said, "You don't have to keep it." For a second, I didn't understand. Then my entire body went cold. I pulled back, staring at him. "What?" He held my gaze. You can get rid of it." My heart stopped. I blinked, waiting for him to say he was joking. But he wasn't. "Frank," my voice was barely a whisper. "Judith, think about it." His voice was desperate now. "If you keep this baby, your life is over. Your parents will disown you. The church will shame you. No one will ever look at you the same way again." I shook my head rapidly. No, I can't." "Why not?" His voice rose slightly. "Why should you have to suffer for what he did? Why should you be the one to pay the price?" I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even think. My hands trembled as I wrapped my arms around myself. I don't know. Frank leaned closer, his voice urgent. Judith, you have to be smart about this. You can't keep this baby. You can't. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head harder. Stop. I'm trying to help you. By telling me to kill my baby? My voice cracked. He flinched. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. I took a deep breath, my chest tight. I can't, Frank. I can't. Then what are you going to do? His voice was almost pleading now. Raise it? Hide it? Give birth and let everyone turn their backs on you? I didn't have an answer, because I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. I pressed my hands to my face, my entire body trembling. This was a nightmare, a living, breathing nightmare. I wished I could wake up. I wished I could rewind time. I wished... Judith. I lowered my hands, slowly. Frank was looking at me, his expression unreadable. If you keep it, he wins. My stomach twisted. He swallowed hard. If you keep this baby, he gets away with everything. He'll still be a priest, still be respected, still be loved. And you? You'll be the girl who ruined her life, the girl no one believes, the girl they whisper about in church. Tears burned my eyes. Frank, please stop. I'm just telling you the truth. I wanted to scream, I wanted to disappear, I wanted to stop existing. Frank exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He looked broken. I don't want to see you suffer, Judith, I really don't. Then don't make me do this. My voice was raw. He sighed heavily, rubbing his face. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, just think about it. I looked away, my heart pounding. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't even want to breathe. But deep down, I knew. This nightmare was far from over. The morning light seeped through the curtains, casting a golden hue across the small room I shared with my younger sister, who was still fast asleep. My heart pounded so hard I feared it might wake her. Today was the day. I couldn't keep this secret any longer. Sliding out of bed, I wrapped my arms around myself, as if that could shield me from the storm I was about to walk into. I could already hear my mother in the sitting room, whispering prayers, her voice steady and strong. She always woke up before sunrise, kneeling before her wooden rosary stand, beads slipping between her fingers as she called upon the Virgin Mary. I hesitated at the doorway watching her. She looked so at peace, so certain in her faith. How would she react when she learned her daughter had been tainted? When she found out the man she revered, the one she called a man of God, was not what he seemed? I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped forward. Mum. My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She didn't stop praying. I cleared my throat, forcing more strength into my words. Mum, I need to talk to you. She finally lifted her head, pressing the last bead between her fingers before making the sign of the cross. What is it, Judith? My knees felt weak, and for a second I considered dropping down beside her, pretending I had come to pray instead. Maybe that would buy me more time. Maybe I could convince myself to just stay silent. But my hands found my stomach, and the slight curve there, though barely noticeable, was enough to remind me that time had already run out. I exhaled shakily. Mum, I'm pregnant. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with something heavy and suffocating. My mother's face was unreadable at first, her dark eyes locked onto mine as if she hadn't quite heard me right. Then, a flicker of shock. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She blinked once, twice, as if waiting for me to say something else, to take it back. I didn't. Her hands clenched around the rosary. You're what? My legs trembled, but I forced myself to stay standing. I'm pregnant. Silence. A silence so loud it roared in my ears, drowning out even the sound of my own breathing. Then, in a voice so sharp it cut straight through me, she asked, Who is responsible for this? I opened my mouth, but the words got caught in my throat. I had known this moment would come, but standing here now with my mother's piercing gaze stripping me bare, I felt paralyzed. The name sat on my tongue, burning, waiting to be spoken, but how could I say it? How could I make her see the truth when I knew she wouldn't want to hear it? My mother's nostrils flared. I said, "Who is responsible?" Her voice rose, demanding, filled with anger and fear. I forced the words out before I lost my nerve. "Father Donald." The world stopped. For a second, I saw something flicker across her face, disbelief, confusion, then rage. The slap came so fast I barely saw her hand move. A sharp sting exploded across my cheek, and the force of it sent me stumbling back. My head snapped to the side, my vision blurred with sudden tears. I tasted blood. "Don't you ever say that again," she spat, her voice shaking. "Are you out of your mind? Do you even hear yourself?" I clutched my face, my skin burning where her palm had struck. "Mum, I'm telling you the truth. The truth!" She cut me off, eyes blazing with fury. "You think I will stand here and listen to this nonsense? You think I will let you slander a man of God with your lies?" I shook my head desperately. "I'm not lying. He always found ways to keep me behind after mass rehearsals. Stop it!" Her voice rang through the house, loud enough to wake my sister. From the corner of my eye, I saw my little sister peeking from the hallway, her tiny face contorted with fear. My mother pointed a trembling finger at me. "I don't know what evil spirit has possessed you, but I will not allow it to destroy this family. Do you hear me?" Tears streamed down my face. "Mum, please listen to me." "Enough!" She turned away as if the very sight of me disgusted her. "Before I return from work today, you will sit here and think about the lies you are telling. And if you ever say this again, Judith, you will no longer have a place in this house." My chest tightened. "Mum?" She didn't look at me. She walked past me, entered the bathroom and slammed the door. I stood there, trembling, tears pouring down my face, my cheek still throbbing from her slap. I had always thought that if something bad ever happened to me, my mother would be the first person to protect me, that she would hold me, fight for me, defend me. But she wasn't my shield. She was the blade. I sat outside the parish office for what felt like an eternity, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my nails dug into my palms. My whole body was trembling, whether from fear or exhaustion, I didn't know. Maybe both. I had spent the entire walk here convincing myself that this was the right thing to do, that I had no choice but to seek help. But now, sitting on this cold wooden bench, I wasn't so sure anymore. Would he even believe me? The parish priest, Father Matthew, was known for his strictness. He was a man of deep faith, unwavering discipline, and absolute devotion to the church. People respected him, even feared him. But most importantly, he was a no-nonsense man. If anyone would get to the truth, it was him. And yet, what if he chose the wrong truth? What if he, like my mother, looked me in the eyes and saw only a liar? I exhaled shakily, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't have any more time to waste. I needed to do this. Summoning every last bit of courage I had left, I stood up and knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Come in." His voice was deep, steady, commanding. I swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room smelled of old books and burning incense. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass window behind him, casting colourful patterns on the wall. Father Matthew sat behind his desk, writing in a large leather-bound journal. He didn't look up immediately. "Yes?" he asked, flipping a page. "What brings you here, Judith?" I opened my mouth, but my throat felt dry, the words stuck somewhere deep inside me. He finally glanced up and his sharp, piercing gaze landed on my face. "Well?" My hands tightened into fists. "Say it, Judith. Say it before you lose your nerve." "Father, I need to talk to you. It's serious." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." I hesitated, my heart hammering. "It's about Father Donald." His expression didn't change, but I noticed the subtle way he straightened in his chair, his grip on the pen tightening. "What about him?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I'm pregnant." Silence. The word hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. He blinked once. "And?" I swallowed hard. "It's his." The pen slipped from his fingers, rolling across the desk. The shock on his face was immediate, but it lasted only a second before his expression hardened into something unreadable. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was something dangerous beneath it. I forced myself to keep my voice steady. "Father Donald is the father of my child." His jaw tightened. "You do understand the weight of what you're saying, don't you?" "Yes, Father." He stood up slowly, rounding the desk until he was directly in front of me. He wasn't a particularly tall man, but at that moment, he felt like a giant towering over me. "If this is true," he said, his voice grave, "then we must get to the root of it." Hope flickered in my chest. Finally, someone who would listen, someone who would fight for me. But then, his next words crushed it. "But if you are lying," he continued, his gaze cold and sharp, "if this is some scheme to ruin him, you will destroy his ordination, his life, his calling." A lump rose in my throat. "I'm not lying, Father." His eyes searched mine as if trying to pull the truth from the very depths of my soul. "You must be absolutely certain. If I investigate this, and it turns out to be false..." Tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "He took my pride away, Father. I swear on my life, on my unborn child's life. I would never lie about this." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Tell me everything," I told him. Every single detail. I told him about how Father Donald had always found ways to keep me behind after altar server rehearsals, how he'd sent the others away and asked me to clean his room, how he always found excuses to have me alone. I told him about the night he offered me and my friend Favor drinks, how we unknowingly switched them, how she had fallen unconscious while I had been sent on an errand, how, when I returned, I found her completely passed out. I told him about the night he finally took what he had been waiting for, how he had forced himself on me, how I had tried to fight, to scream, but the walls of the parish house had swallowed my voice. By the time I finished, my whole body was shaking. I could barely breathe, barely move. Father Matthew sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His expression was troubled, but still there was something in his eyes. Doubt. "You're saying all this happened and you told no one?" I bit my lip, nodding. I was scared. Who would have believed me? He sighed. "And your mother? What did she say?" I let out a bitter laugh, though there was nothing humorous about it. "She called me a liar. She said I was possessed, that I was trying to ruin a man of God." Father Matthew closed his eyes briefly, then let out another deep breath. "This is a very serious accusation, Judith." I leaned forward, my voice desperate. "It's not an accusation, Father. It's the truth." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out as if searching for answers in the sky. Finally, he turned back to me. "I will investigate this. But understand, this is not something that can be handled lightly. If the diocese gets involved, it will affect everyone. The church, your family, the entire community. Do you understand?" I nodded. "I need to know," he continued. "Do you have any evidence? Anything that can support your claims?" I hesitated. "Favor, the girl who was with me that night. She was the one who drank the drugged drink. She might remember something." He nodded. "I will speak with her. But Judith..." I looked up. "Be prepared." "For what?" I whispered. "For the worst." I already was. Favor was the only person I could turn to now. If anyone could help me, it was her. She had been there. She had drunk that poisoned drink. She had passed out right in front of me. She knew what had happened, even if she didn't remember every detail. And most importantly, she was my friend. So why was I so afraid as I stood outside her house, my fists clenched tightly by my sides? I took a shaky breath and knocked on the door. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and there she was. Favor. Her hair was wrapped in a scarf, and she wore a loose t-shirt that hung over one shoulder. She looked tired, like she had just woken up. The moment she saw me, her brows furrowed. "Judith?" I tried to smile, but my lips trembled too much. Hey, she hesitated. What are you doing here? I swallowed hard. I need to talk to you. Favor sighed, glancing over her shoulder before stepping outside, closing the door behind her. Is this about… Yes, I said quickly. It's about Father Donald, about what he did to me, to us. She exhaled, rubbing her arms like she was suddenly cold. Judith, I need you, Favor. I interrupted, my voice trembling. I need you to tell the truth. Her whole body stiffened. The truth? You were there! My voice rose in desperation. That night in the parish house, he gave us drinks. You drank the one that was meant for me, and you passed out. He drugged you, Favor. He planned to do it to me. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away. Please, I begged, stepping closer, just tell them what happened. Just tell them that you drank it and blacked out, that you woke up confused, that… I can't. The words hit me like a slap. I froze. What? She shook her head. I can't, Judith. I won't. I blinked at her, my stomach twisting. Why? She bit her lip. Because you won't win this. No one will believe you. My heart dropped. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign that she was joking, that she was scared but still willing to do the right thing. But there was nothing. Only cold, brutal honesty. I don't understand, I whispered. You saw what he did. You felt it. I don't remember anything, she shot back. I passed out, remember? I don't even know if it was really him who did anything. For all we know, No, I cut in sharply. Don't do that. Don't pretend you don't know what happened. You woke up dazed. You kept saying you felt weird. And what does that prove, Judith? She snapped, crossing her arms. That I had a headache? That I was dizzy? What if I was just tired? I felt sick. This was Favor, the girl I had trusted, laughed with, shared secrets with. And here she was, tearing away the last bit of hope I had left. Favor, I whispered, my throat aching. Please, she sighed, rubbing her forehead. Look, Judith, I'm sorry, okay? But I can't help you. Even if I stand by you, it won't change anything. Father Donald is… I don't care who he is, I snapped. She flinched. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. Favor, I'm pregnant. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Shock, maybe even guilt. But it disappeared just as quickly. Then, get rid of it, I gasped. My whole body went cold. What? She sighed, looking away. Just abort it and move on. I took a step back as if she had physically struck me. You can't be serious. I am serious, Judith. It's the only way. If you keep this baby, you'll ruin your life. I shook my head in disbelief. Are you hearing yourself right now? I'm trying to help you, she insisted. No, I whispered. You're trying to make this easier for you. Her face hardened. Judith, I'm telling you the truth. No one will believe you. No one will fight for you. Not your mother, not your father, not even the parish priest. And definitely not me. I felt like I was going to be sick. You're my friend, I whispered. She let out a bitter laugh. And you're asking me to destroy my life for you. Do you think they'll leave me alone if I speak up? Do you think Father Donald will just sit back and accept it? Do you know how powerful he is? How many people love him? If I stand with you, they'll come for me too. My family, my reputation, everything. You're afraid, I realized. Her jaw tightened. That's what this is, I said. You're scared. I'm smart, she shot back, and if you were smart, you'd drop this before it ruins you. I wiped at my face, not even realizing I was crying. So you're really going to pretend like none of this happened? She lifted her chin. I was never there. Those 4 words shattered me. I sucked in a shaky breath, my chest tightening. You were the only person who could help me. And I won't, she said flatly. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her, to make her see the weight of what she was doing, but I knew deep down that nothing I said would change her mind. I was truly alone. I turned away, forcing my legs to move even though my whole body felt heavy. Judith, she called softly. I paused but didn't turn around. I am sorry, she murmured. I squeezed my eyes shut. No, she wasn't. Because if she truly was sorry, she wouldn't be standing on the sidelines while I drowned. She wouldn't be choosing her own comfort over my truth. I walked away without another word, my heart breaking with every step. I heard the car pull up outside and my heart nearly stopped. My father was home. I gripped the edge of the dining table, my knuckles turning white. The air in the house felt heavier than ever, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I wasn't ready for this, but it didn't matter. The door swung open and my father stepped inside, his presence filling the room instantly. He looked different. His face was glowing with some kind of spiritual fire. His eyes bright, his posture upright with pride. He carried his small leather Bible in one hand, his rosary beads wrapped tightly around the other. He had been away for days on a retreat, a special program with other devout men, fasting, praying, receiving divine revelations. And now he was back to hear what his daughter had done. "Welcome, my husband," she said, taking his bag from him. "How was the retreat?" "It was powerful," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "God moved in ways you cannot imagine. The sick were healed, the blind saw, demons fled at the mention of Jesus' name." My mother nodded enthusiastically, already leading him to the couch. "You must be tired. Sit, let me bring you water." He sighed as he sat down, stretching his legs, rubbing his forehead. "Ah, you should have seen it. And Father Donald, oh, that man!" He clapped his hands together, shaking his head in awe. "He is truly a vessel of God. The way he prayed, the way he ministered, he is already a priest in spirit. The anointing on his life is undeniable." My stomach twisted. Mother exchanged a quick glance with me before sitting beside him. She took a deep breath. "My husband, there is something we must discuss." He frowned, glancing between us. "What is it?" She hesitated. Then, with no warning, she said it. "Judith is pregnant." The words landed like a slap. The room seemed to go still. I held my breath, waiting for his reaction. His brows furrowed, as if he hadn't heard properly. "What?" "She is pregnant," my mother repeated. He turned to me, his face unreadable. "Is this true?" I could barely move. My hands trembled as I forced myself to nod. For a moment, he just stared. Then, very quietly, he said, "Who?" My throat felt like it was closing, but I had to say it. "Father Donald." The second his name left my lips, my father jerked back like I had struck him. The change in his face was immediate. His eyes darkened, his lips parted in shock. Then, just as quickly, his expression twisted into rage. "Shut your mouth!" he roared. I flinched. "You are possessed!" His voice thundered through the room, rattling the very air. "You want to destroy a man of God? You, my own daughter?" Tears welled in my eyes. "Father, please believe me." "Believe you?" He shot to his feet, shaking with fury. "I just spent 4 days praying beside this man. I watched him heal the sick with his own hands. I saw him weep for the lost, speak in tongues, minister to the brokenhearted. And you want me to believe that he is the one who—" "Yes," I sobbed. "Yes, Father, it was him. Please, I swear." "Enough!" His voice cracked through the air like a whip. I choked on my breath, stumbling backward. My mother sat still, her hands folded in her lap, staring at me with disappointment. "Judith!" my father seethed, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "Do you know what you are saying? Do you even understand the gravity of this accusation?" Tears streamed down my face. "I understand, Father, but I am telling the truth." He shook his head in disgust. "The devil has taken hold of you." I cried harder. "No, he drugged Favor." "Where is the proof?" he barked. I froze. "Where is the evidence?" he shouted, stepping closer. "Did you see him do it with your own eyes? Did anyone witness it? Can you prove it beyond your words?" I opened my mouth, but no words came, because I couldn't. Favor had abandoned me. No one else had been there. It was just me, my word against his. And to my father, that wasn't enough. He let out a bitter laugh. You think you can ruin a man's life because of a fantasy in your head? Father, please. You disgust me, I gasped. The room tilted. I couldn't breathe. My own father. The man who had raised me, who had prayed over me as a child, who had taught me right from wrong. He looked at me now like I was filth. You are an agent of darkness, he spat. Sent to bring down a great man of God. You should fall on your knees right now and beg for forgiveness before God strikes you down for this abomination. I was shaking so hard, my legs almost gave out. You think you can destroy the work of God? You think the church will let you? He pointed a trembling finger at me. You will be the one destroyed, Judith, not him. You. I clutched my stomach, feeling the weight of his words sink into my bones. But I am your daughter, I whispered. His eyes flashed with something, pain, regret, but it was gone in an instant. You were, he said coldly, but not anymore. I gasped, my vision blurring. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. From today, I have no daughter. I let out a broken sob. My mother sat silently beside him, not speaking, not interfering. It was done. I was alone. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and something else, something cold and sterile like a place where truth couldn't be ignored. I sat on the examination table, my legs dangling over the edge, my hands gripping the thin paper sheet beneath me. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, held the test results in her hands. She didn't even have to say it. I already knew. Still, when she looked up and said, "You're pregnant?" it felt like the world had cracked open beneath me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My mother stood beside me, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She showed no emotion, no surprise, no sadness, no concern, just silent judgment. The doctor asked if I was okay, if I needed anything. I wanted to laugh, I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that what I needed was for someone to believe me. But instead, I just nodded. We left the hospital without a word. The ride home was suffocating. My mother drove in silence, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I kept my gaze on the window, watching the world blur past, people moving about their day as if my life hadn't just been torn apart. As soon as we got home, my father was waiting. He didn't even ask what the doctor said. He already knew. My mother must have told him before we even left the hospital. He stood with his arms behind his back, his expression unreadable. But when he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than I ever thought possible. "You'll leave for the village first thing tomorrow morning." I flinched. "The village?" My voice cracked. "Your grandmother will take care of you until the child is born," my mother added, her voice emotionless. I looked between them, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're sending me away?" My father nodded. "We will not allow you to destroy this family's name over your foolishness." Foolishness. I felt something inside me snap. I had begged them to believe me, I had told them the truth. And now, instead of standing by me, instead of fighting for me, they were sending me away, hiding me like a stain they couldn't wash off. "What about Father Donald?" I whispered. My father's face hardened. "There is no Father Donald in this conversation," he said. I stared at him in disbelief. "He did this to me." My voice rose, shaking with anger. "And you're just going to let him walk free, pretend like it never happened?" My mother sighed as if I were the problem. "Judith, enough." "Enough?" I laughed bitterly. "You're ashamed of me, but you're still serving him food every morning, aren't you?" She froze. I turned to her fully now, the rage bubbling inside me, no longer contained. "You still wake up before sunrise, pack his meals and take them to the parish house, don't you?" She didn't answer, because we all knew the truth. Every morning my mother would wake before dawn, prepare steaming hot food, and take it to the very man who had stolen everything from me. She still served him, still revered him. She believed him, not me. My hands clenched into fists. How do you sleep at night?" She shot me a sharp look. "Mind your tongue, Judith." I laughed again, hollow and humorless. "No, tell me. How do you kneel down in prayer every night and talk to God when you're feeding the man who raped your daughter?" Her hand moved so fast I barely saw it coming. Slap. The sting burned my cheek, but I didn't cry this time. I just stood there staring at her, breathing heavily. She turned away from me, shaking her head. "I will not let you ruin his ordination. Do you know how much work has gone into this? Do you know how many lives he has touched?" I let out a trembling breath. "He touched me too, Mother." She shut her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply before turning to my father. "We should start packing her things." That was it. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was a burden, a disgrace. They wanted me gone. I turned and walked out of the room, my vision blurred with unshed tears. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window staring at the dark sky, listening to the distant sound of crickets. My chest felt hollow, my body numb. They were sending me away. They had chosen him over me. But I wasn't going to disappear quietly. Number, they could send me away, they could call me a liar, but I wouldn't forget, and I wouldn't forgive. I stood outside the parish house, my hands clenched into fists, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled softly, signaling the evening prayer. I had thought about this moment all night. I had rehearsed what I would say, how I would say it. But now, standing here facing the heavy wooden door that separated me from the man who had destroyed my life, all my words seemed to evaporate. Still, I couldn't leave without seeing him, without facing him. I knocked. A moment passed, then another. I had just begun to wonder if he would ignore me when the door creaked open. And there he was, Father Donald, dressed in his crisp white cassock, looking as composed as ever, like a man at peace with himself. His eyes swept over me, and for a brief second, something flickered in them. Surprise, maybe? Annoyance? Then it was gone. "Judith," he said, his voice smooth, unshaken. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "We need to talk." He glanced around, then stepped aside, allowing me in. The room smelled of old books and candle wax. The large crucifix on the wall seemed to loom over me, its shadow stretching across the floor. My stomach twisted at the irony of it all. Father Donald shut the door behind me. "Well," he said, folding his hands in front of him, "what is so important that you would sneak in here at this hour?" I took a deep breath, my fists trembling at my sides. "You ruined my life." He tilted his head slightly as if considering my words, then sighed. "Judith, I'm disappointed in you." I flinched, caught off guard. "Disappointed?" "Yes," he said, stepping toward me. "I truly thought you were smarter than this. More reasonable." I felt my body go rigid. "You forced yourself on me." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No one will believe that." I took a shaky step back. "I told my parents." His expression didn't change. "And?" My breath hitched. "And they called me a liar," I whispered. He nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "Of course they did." I shook my head, anger rising in my chest like a fire about to consume me. "I told the parish priest." Now a flicker of something, annoyance maybe, crossed his face. "That was a foolish move, Judith." "Was it?" I snapped. "He's investigating you." Father Donald chuckled, a low, almost amused sound. "Is he?" He walked past me toward his desk, his fingers brushing over a stack of neatly arranged papers. "And what do you think will happen when he does?" "Do you think the church will turn against me? That the people will? That the police will storm in here and drag me away in chains?" I said nothing, my breath shallow, my body tense. He turned back to me, his voice gentle now, almost pitying. "The church will protect me. The people will stand by me. You? You'll be nothing but a desperate, bitter girl who tried to ruin a man of God's life. I felt sick. I had known deep down that this would be his reaction, but hearing it, seeing his absolute confidence made my stomach churn. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You need to accept this, Judith. You need to move on. My jaw clenched. I'm pregnant. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. His eyes flickered to my stomach, then back to my face. So? I swallowed hard. You're the father. He smiled again, slow and infuriating. No one will believe that either. I let out a shaky breath. I'll take a DNA test. He chuckled again. And who will allow it? The police? The same police who kneel before me every Sunday for blessings? Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You should get rid of it, he said suddenly, his voice sharp and dismissive. Have the procedure and forget this ever happened. I recoiled. What? He sighed as if I was the one being unreasonable. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Why tie yourself to a scandal that won't even work in your favor? I stared at him, disgust curling in my stomach. You really think you'll get away with this, don't you? His smile returned, calm and composed. I know I will. Silence stretched between us. My hands trembled, my nails digging into my palms. I had come here hoping for what? An apology? A confession? Even the slightest crack in his armor? But he wasn't afraid. He wasn't guilty. He wasn't sorry. And that terrified me more than anything. I took a step back toward the door, my whole body shaking with rage. You will regret this, I said, my voice trembling but firm. Father Donald didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply smiled. We'll see about that. I turned, yanked the door open and stormed out into the night, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I had never hated anyone the way I hated him in that moment, and I knew without a doubt that this wasn't over. The morning I was supposed to leave for the village, I woke up feeling hollow. I lay on my thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of my mother in the kitchen. She was probably preparing Father Donald's meal just like she did every morning. The thought made my stomach twist. They were sending me away like I was the shameful one, like I was the one who needed to be hidden. Not him. Not the man who had done this to me. I turned my head to the side, my packed bag sitting by the door like a reminder that I no longer belonged here. I closed my eyes and swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. Would I ever belong anywhere again? A knock on the door made me jump. Judith, get up, my mother's voice called. You're leaving in an hour. I didn't answer. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of hearing how broken I sounded. Instead, I forced myself up, my body feeling heavier than it ever had before. My legs ached as I moved to the corner of the room, reaching for my bag. That was when I heard it. A beep, loud, sharp, from the sitting room. Then silence. Then, my father's voice, low and unreadable. What is this? I froze. I couldn't make out my mother's response, but I heard the hurried shuffle of feet. Something was happening. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wooden frame. Another beep. My father was rereading something. Then, his voice again, but this time there was something strange in it, something tight. We have to go. Now. What? My mother's voice was sharper. Go where? The church, my father said. The parish council has summoned us. They want to see us immediately. My stomach flipped. The parish council? Why? My mother sucked in a breath. Who told them? Does it matter? My father snapped. They are calling for us. They want us to bring Judith. I barely had time to step back before my door flew open. My mother stood there, her face pale, her eyes sharp with panic. Get dressed, she ordered. I looked between her and my father, my pulse racing. What's happening? My father's jaw clenched. You should know. You caused this. Caused this? They were angry, terrified, because this was what they had been avoiding all along. They never wanted this to go beyond our four walls. They wanted to bury it, silence me. But now, It had reached the parish council. I should have been afraid too, but deep inside me, something small, something fragile, began to flicker. Hope. This was it. This was the moment they could no longer ignore. I felt my heart pound as I whispered, "Are they going to listen to me?" My father scoffed. "They are going to listen to the truth." I clenched my fists. "I am telling the truth." His nostrils flared, but before he could say anything, my mother grabbed my arm. "Enough. Go and get ready. We have no choice but to go." She let me go, turning back to my father. What if they believe her? The way she said it, like the idea was impossible, absurd. My father's face darkened. "They won't." I swallowed hard. They still didn't believe me. Even now, when the church itself was getting involved, they were still more concerned about protecting Father Donald than their own daughter. The tiny flicker of hope inside me dimmed, but I held on to it anyway. Because whether they believed me or not, I was going to speak. I turned away, shutting the door before they could say anything else. I reached for my dress, the plainest one I owned, because I didn't want to give them any reason to say I looked indecent or shameful. I brushed my hair back, my hands shaking slightly. I was still afraid. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something else too. A chance. A chance to be heard. A chance for justice. And I was going to take it. The parish council hall was packed. I felt the weight of every gaze on me as I stepped inside, my parents flanking me like guards escorting a criminal. The room smelled of polished wood and old books, the scent of burning incense still lingering in the air. The heavy wooden crucifix on the far wall seemed to loom over me, watching, judging. I swallowed hard, my palms damp. Rows of council members sat before me, their expressions unreadable, some stiff with skepticism, others tight with something that almost looked like concern. Father Matthew, the parish priest, sat at the centre, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He was the one who had promised to look into my story. I searched his face for reassurance, for anything that told me I wasn't walking into a trap. But his face remained unreadable. My father's grip on my wrist tightened for a second before he let go. A warning, a reminder. I knew what he wanted, what they both wanted. Don't embarrass us. Don't ruin a man of God. Don't make us the family that destroyed Father Donald's ordination. But I was past that. This wasn't about them anymore. "Judith," Father Matthew's voice was steady but firm. "Step forward." I did. My knees trembling, my throat tight. "Tell us everything," he said. From the beginning. I hesitated. Not because I didn't know what to say. I had replayed it in my head so many times that it was burned into my memory, but because I knew that once I spoke, I could never take it back. I glanced at my mother. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes cold. My father wouldn't even look at me. They were waiting for me to fail. Waiting for me to break. I took a shaky breath and turned back to the council, and then I spoke. I told them everything. How it started with the little things. Father Donald asking me to clean his room after mass server practice, the way his eyes lingered too long, the way his hands brushed against me when they didn't need to. How that one night when I was with Favor, he offered us drinks, how we switched by accident, and she was the one who drank whatever he had put in mine. How he sent me on an errand, and when I came back, I found Favor unconscious, her breathing slow, her body limp. How I panicked, shook her, tried to wake her up, but he told me not to worry, that she just needed to rest. How I had ignored the warning bells in my head, because why would a priest, a soon-to-be priest, do something so evil? And then, how it finally happened. How he used his authority, his power, to lure me into his room again, sending away the only other person with me. How he locked the door. How he pounced. How he stole something from me that I could never get back. My voice shook as I spoke, but I didn't stop. I told them about the fear, the shame, the pain that followed. The loneliness when my own mother slapped me, when my father called me possessed. I told them about how no one believed me, how even now, as I stood here, I could feel the doubt radiating from the very people who were supposed to serve justice. I finished speaking, my throat raw, my chest rising and falling as I struggled to catch my breath. The silence that followed was suffocating. I scanned the room. Some faces were blank, others skeptical. One woman at the far end had her hands clasped in front of her lips, her eyes glistening, but no one spoke. Then, a voice. "Father Donald?" It was Father Matthew. Step forward. I turned. The room shifted. The energy changed. And there he was, Father Donald. His white cassock was pristine, his hands folded in front of him like a devoted servant of God. Tears glistened in his eyes and he exhaled shakily, his entire body trembling. I clenched my fists. He was going to lie. I could feel it. And yet, as he opened his mouth, as his voice cracked with emotion, I knew the room would believe him before they ever believed me, because he wasn't just any man. He was a man of God. The room was silent as Father Donald stepped forward. His head was bowed, his hands clasped in front of him like a man about to pray. Tears glistened in his eyes, reflecting the dim light of the parish hall. His shoulders trembled as he inhaled shakily, his entire frame exuding sorrow, suffering. And I just knew that this was the moment he would turn everything against me. The moment he would twist the truth into something so unrecognizable that even I would question whether I had imagined it all. He sniffled, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his white cassock. "My beloved brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, his voice breaking, and that was all it took. Already heads were nodding in sympathy. I could hear soft sighs of pity, the kind people give when they see someone suffering unjustly. I wanted to scream, but I stayed still. I waited. He exhaled deeply and looked up at the council, at the parish priest, at my parents. Finally, his gaze settled on me. And then he spoke. "This is the cross I must bear," he said, shaking his head. "Just like our Lord Jesus Christ, who was falsely accused and sentenced to death, I too find myself a victim of wickedness." Murmurs rippled through the room. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palms. "You all know me," he continued. "I have dedicated my life to serving God, to serving this parish. I have prayed for your children, fasted for their salvation, counseled them when they lost their way. And yet here I stand, accused of something so vile, so unthinkable." His voice cracked on the last word. Someone gasped softly, as if the very idea of him committing such a sin was impossible. I felt sick. "Judith," he turned to me now, his expression pained, "I have tried to guide you. You know that. I have counseled you more than once, warned you about the dangers of the path you were walking." I frowned. What was he talking about? He turned back to the council. "I have seen her time and time again with Frank." The moment he said that name, I felt my stomach drop. Frank? My friend? Where was he going with this? "I have caught them together," Father Donald continued, his voice firm now, strong. "At the basement, behind the church, hidden in corners where they thought no one would see them. I have scolded her. I have warned her that she was losing herself to temptation, that she was walking a dangerous road." I could hear whispers now. I shook my head. "That's not true," I whispered, but my voice was drowned by the noise. Father Donald sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead as if recalling something painful. "When I threatened to tell her parents, she begged me not to," he said. "She told me I had no right to interfere in her private affairs, that she was old enough to make her own choices." I took a step forward. "That is a lie," I said, louder this time. But no one was listening to me. They were looking at him. He was playing his role so well, weaving a story so convincing, so perfect. "She told me," he continued, "that if I ever tried to expose her, she would make me regret it." I felt like the ground beneath me was splitting open. I didn't think much of it then, he sighed. I thought she would come to her senses. I thought, with prayer, she would find her way back. He turned his gaze on me again, and this time I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Satisfaction. He knew what he was doing. And he was enjoying it. But now, he whispered, shaking his head, I see that I underestimated how far she would go. A few people gasped. She is with child, he said, his voice thick with emotion, and instead of owning up to her actions, instead of seeking forgiveness and redemption, she has chosen to ruin me instead. I couldn't breathe. She knows what this means for me, he continued. She knows that my ordination is days away, that the church has invested in me, that the people of this parish look up to me. She knew that a simple accusation could destroy me, and yet, he inhaled deeply, his lips trembling, and yet, she did it anyway. This couldn't be happening. She wanted to ruin my priesthood, he whispered, as if the very thought shattered him. Because I tried to correct her. I stared at him, unable to move, unable to speak. I wasn't looking at a man of God. I was looking at a monster. And the worst part? They believed him. I had never felt more alone in my life. I sat there, frozen, as the murmurs in the hall grew louder, feeding off Father Donald's lies like flames devouring dry wood. But the worst was yet to come. Call Frank, someone said. And that was when the last bit of hope I had clung to turned to dust. Frank, my childhood friend, my closest companion, the one person I had believed would never turn against me. I turned my head slowly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears as he stepped forward. His face was unreadable. His hands were clasped in front of him, much like Father Donald's had been moments ago. But there was no hesitation in his steps, no reluctance in his posture. He wasn't afraid. I swallowed hard. He was about to lie. I could feel it before he even opened his mouth. Frank, the parish priest called out, you've heard everything. You know why you're here. Yes, Father, he said, his voice steady. I wanted to scream at him, don't do this. But I couldn't move. The air felt too thick, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a boulder. The priest nodded at him. Speak. Frank sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if this was difficult for him. I didn't want it to come to this, he began, his voice laced with false guilt. I clenched my fists. But I can't stay silent, he continued. The truth needs to be told. I knew what was coming. I still wasn't prepared. Judith and I... He hesitated, then let out another sigh, shaking his head like someone burdened by a heavy secret. We were in a relationship. The words sliced through me like a blade. A murmur swept through the crowd. I jerked forward, my breath catching in my throat. That's not true. Frank barely spared me a glance. We've been together for a while, he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. But we kept it a secret. We didn't want anyone to know. I shook my head furiously. Frank, what are you doing? But he wouldn't look at me. I made a mistake, he said. I let things get out of hand. I should have been more careful. Gasps, shuffling feet, a few people whispering. I felt like I was suffocating. The truth is, he swallowed hard, then forced out the words that would destroy me. Judith got pregnant, and she didn't know what to do. She panicked. The whispers grew louder. She told me she couldn't face her parents, he continued, his voice steady, smooth, rehearsed. She was scared. She thought they'd throw her out, that they'd never forgive her. And then she had an idea. I was shaking now. She said she'd blame someone else. I gasped. Frank turned toward Father Donald, his expression one of guilt and regret. I never thought she'd go this far, he said, but she was desperate. My world tilted. My father let out a deep, shuddering breath. I turned to look at him, and the pain I saw in his eyes was unbearable. He believed him. My own father believed him. I felt something inside me snap. I surged to my feet. You're lying, I screamed. We were just friends. We've always been just friends. Frank didn't flinch. He wouldn't even look at me. Why are you doing this? I choked out. Why are you lying? Still nothing. I turned to the council, to the faces watching me with a mixture of pity and judgment. He's lying, I pleaded. Please, you all know me. I've never... Enough! The parish priest's voice cut through my desperate cries like a blade. I turned to him, my chest heaving. He was staring at me with unreadable eyes. My mother was sobbing softly, her head bowed in shame. My father sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists, his face buried in his palms. I wanted to wake up. I wanted to claw my way out of this nightmare. But it was real, and they believed him. A slow, suffocating realization settled over me like a death shroud. I had lost. I didn't think my heart could break any more than it already had. I was wrong. The moment they called Favor's name, my blood turned to ice. She wasn't supposed to be here. I hadn't seen her since the day I begged her to stand by me. Since the day she turned her back on me and told me to get rid of it. I had thought that was the worst she could do. But as she stepped forward, her chin held high, her expression unreadable, I felt my body go numb. She wasn't here to help me. She was here to finish me. Favor, the parish priest said, his voice grave. You were present that day. You drank the juice Father Donald gave. Tell us what you know. I swallowed, my lips trembling. Favor glanced at me for a split second. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't regret. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind. Then she spoke. I need to confess. Her voice was steady, calm. I have been keeping this to myself for too long, but I can't anymore. I gripped the edge of my chair, my nails digging into the wood. I was there when it all started, she continued, her voice thick with something I couldn't name. Judith. Judith told me she wanted to ruin Father Donald's life. My breath hitched. The room fell deathly silent. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. She said she was tired of how he was always correcting her. Favor went on, her voice stronger now, more confident. She said he was interfering too much in her life. She wanted to punish him. I shook my head, my vision blurring. Number no, no, no. She told me the plan. Favor continued, her hands clasped together like she was praying for mercy. She said we'd go to the parish house, that if Father Donald offered us anything, I should drink it, that I should pretend to be asleep. I clutched my chest. I felt like I was going to vomit. She told me that when she left the room, I should spread my legs a little, she said, her voice growing softer, like she was ashamed to even say the words. So that when she came back, she could make it look like something had happened. I gasped. The room erupted in whispers. I turned to my father. He was staring at the floor. My mother was shaking her head, tears slipping down her face. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. She wanted to set him up, Favor whispered. She wanted everyone to think he was a monster. But he never touched me. A sharp, strangled sound escaped my throat. I didn't recognize my own voice. I didn't recognize my own life. She planned all of this, Favor said, and I can't be part of it anymore. She finally looked at me then, but it wasn't the look of a friend. It was the look of someone who had just delivered the final blow. I stood up, my legs shaking so badly I thought I'd fall. Favor, I croaked. Why are you doing this? She said nothing. I turned to the parish priest, to the council, to anyone who would listen. She's lying, I cried. You all know me. You know I would never... Enough. The parish priest's voice rang out like a judge delivering a verdict. I flinched. I looked at my father again, silently begging him to stand up, to fight for me. He didn't. He kept his head down. I turned to my mother. She was already wiping her tears as if she had accepted it, as if she had accepted that I was guilty. I staggered backward, my chest tightening. They believed her. They all believed her. My legs gave out beneath me and I crumpled to the floor. I wasn't crying, I wasn't screaming. I just sat there staring at nothing as the world around me collapsed. Favor had won. Father Donald had won. And I had lost everything. The room buzzed with hushed voices. The parish council huddled together, whispering among themselves, casting occasional glances in my direction. But I already knew. I didn't need to hear their verdict. I had already lost. My body felt hollow, like a house abandoned after a storm. My ears rang, drowning out the murmurs, the shifting feet, the rustling of robes. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, not because I was ashamed. No, that wasn't it. I just couldn't bear to look up and see the triumph in Father Donald's eyes, or worse, the disappointment in my father's. The parish priest finally stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We have reached a decision." A cold wave of silence washed over the hall. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. He turned to Father Donald first. "We commend you," he said solemnly, "for your patience, your dignity, and your unwavering faith in the midst of this terrible accusation." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I squeezed my hands into fists. "You have carried this cross with the grace of a true servant of God," the priest continued, "and for that, we honor you." A few people nodded. Some even clapped softly. I wanted to scream, to stand up and shout at them, shake them, make them see the truth. But my voice was gone. Then the priest turned to me. "And as for you, Judith," I braced myself, "you have brought shame upon this church." Each word struck like a lash against my skin. "You have attempted to destroy a man of God, a man who has dedicated his life to this community. No. Your lies have not only wounded Father Donald, but have disgraced your family." A sharp intake of breath came from beside me. I turned, hope sparking for a fraction of a second. My father was standing. His face was carved from stone, his lips pressed into a firm, unforgiving line. For a moment, I thought, "Please, Papa, please." But then he spoke. "My daughter is no longer my daughter." The room spun. A gasp rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke against him. His words were final, unshakable. He turned away from me, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable, like I was already dead to him, like I had never been his child at all. A numbness settled into my bones. I wanted to cry, to break down, to scream at him. Why? But I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The parish priest sighed. "It is decided. Judith, you are to leave this town. Immediately." No one objected. No one fought for me. I looked at my mother one last time. She was crying, but she didn't move. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out. The journey away from everything I had ever known felt unreal, like I was floating outside my own body, watching a version of myself being discarded like garbage. No one spoke to me as I was packed into the worn-out old bus that would take me to my grandmother's village. My father didn't come to see me off. My mother, oh, my mother, stood at a distance, wringing her hands, her eyes red but dry. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't hug me. She didn't fight for me. The bus door slammed shut, and with it something inside me shattered. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass window, my breath fogging up the surface. Outside, the town I had grown up in blurred past me. The market stalls where I had walked with Mama to buy vegetables, the small school building where I had dreamed of becoming something greater, the towering walls of the church where I had once felt safe. Safe. What a cruel word. I let out a slow, shaky breath and rested a hand over my stomach. "You're still here," I thought. "They abandoned me, but I still have you." Tears threatened to spill, but I clenched my jaw and forced them down. I would not cry anymore. I had cried enough. The bus rumbled on, carrying me farther and farther away from my old life, from my innocence, from the girl I had been before Father Donald stole everything from me. The moment I stepped off at the village station, the weight of my disgrace settled onto my shoulders. I was alone. No one to run to. No friends, no family who believed me. I walked slowly toward my grandmother's house, my feet dragging like I was wading through mud. She was waiting at the door, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her lips pressed together. She didn't look surprised to see me. I had a feeling she had been told everything already. She led me inside, her silence sharp as a blade. "You will work in this house," she said simply. "You will not bring shame to me the way you brought shame to your parents." I swallowed hard and nodded. No argument, no defense, there was no point. That night, lying on a thin mattress in the tiny room she had given me, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the crushing weight of what had happened. The injustice of it all burned inside me, a slow, simmering rage. They had cast me away to protect a predator. They had thrown me to the wolves to save a man wrapped in the skin of a saint. But one day, the truth would come out. One day, they would all see him for what he truly was. And on that day, I would not be the one drowning in shame. I would be the one watching as they burned. I spent my days cleaning, washing, cooking, chores that never seemed to end. My grandmother made sure I worked hard, as if trying to punish me into repentance. But at night, when the house was quiet, I sat by the small wooden table in my room and wrote. I wrote everything, every moment, every detail, every touch, every word Father Donald had spoken to me the night he stole my dignity. I wrote about Favor, about the drink we had switched, about how she had seen the truth with her own eyes but still chose to betray me. I wrote about Frank, about the look in his eyes when he lied, when he handed me over to the wolves just to protect a monster. I wrote about my mother's silence, my father's rage, the slap, the names they called me. I filled pages with my pain, my anger, my truth. No one believed me, but the words on the paper did. And I promised myself, one day, someone else would too. The tree had become my only friend. Its shade was the only thing that offered me any comfort in this suffocating place. I sat beneath it, my back pressed against its rough bark, my knees pulled close to my chest, and I stared at the world around me with empty eyes. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since I was cast out like I never mattered. 3 weeks since my parents turned their backs on me. 3 weeks since I became nothing more than a stain they wanted to erase. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. But even worse than my parents' rejection, even worse than my grandmother's coldness, was them. Favor. Frank. How could they? How could Favor, my best friend, the girl I had shared my secrets with, the one who knew me better than anyone, look me in the eye and lie? And Frank? Frank, who had once sworn to protect me, who had promised to stand by my side no matter what. Frank, whose laughter had once been my favorite sound, whose friendship had felt like home. He had thrown me to the wolves. For what? For money? For approval? I hugged my knees tighter, my body shaking with a mixture of sorrow and rage. The betrayal wasn't just painful, it was unbelievable. These were people I had trusted with my life. And they had turned away so easily, so effortlessly, as if I had never mattered to them at all. Father Donald sat in his office, his fingers gliding over the crisp pages of the documents spread out before him. The room smelled of old books and polished wood, a scent that once brought him comfort, but today it only filled him with impatience. His ordination was just days away. The moment he had fought so hard for was finally within his grasp, and yet he felt no real sense of victory, only relief. Relief that he had managed to survive the storm, that he had come out of it not only unscathed but elevated. To the church, he was a martyr. The parishioners spoke his name with reverence, whispering in hushed tones about how he had endured false accusations with unwavering faith. The archdiocese had done everything in their power to ensure that his ordination would be a grand affair, as if to erase every shadow of doubt that had ever been cast upon him. They praised him, they celebrated him, and soon he would stand before them all, wearing the robes of a fully ordained priest, a symbol of victory, of redemption. A slow smile curled at the corners of his lips. Yes, he had won. Reaching for a pen, he dipped it into the inkwell and signed another document with steady, practiced strokes. Each signature brought him closer to the moment when no one would ever question his authority again. A sharp knock at the door made him pause. His eyes flickered toward the entrance, irritation flashing across his face. He already knew who it was. With a controlled breath, he leaned back in his chair, adopting the calm, measured expression that had fooled so many before. "Come in," he said. The door creaked open and Favor stepped inside. She hesitated for only a second before shutting the door behind her, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Father Donald watched her, his expression unreadable. Favor had always been easy to manipulate. A little money, a few whispered promises, and she had been more than willing to play her part. But lately, she had become impatient, restless, and that could be dangerous. She stood there staring at him, her face twisted with frustration. "You promised," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Donald sighed as if the conversation bored him. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "I told you," he said smoothly. "I will send it to you soon, probably before my ordination." Favor's hands tightened into fists. "I've been waiting for months," she snapped. "You keep saying soon. When is soon?" Father Donald's expression didn't change. "Favor," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "I understand your frustration, but these things take time. You will have your money." Her eyes burned with anger. "I kept my end of the deal," she hissed. "I did everything you asked. Father Donald held up a hand, cutting her off. "And I will keep my end," he said coolly. "But you need to be patient." Favor's lips trembled. She had once been so confident, so sure of herself. But now, standing here before him, she looked small, desperate. And desperate people were dangerous. Father Donald's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his voice calm. "Do not forget," he said softly. "What is at stake here?" Favor's breath hitched. For a moment, her eyes darted to the floor, her resolve wavering. Father Donald pressed on. "You have a future ahead of you," he continued, his tone almost gentle. "Do not let your impatience ruin everything." Silence hung between them. Then, finally, Favor exhaled shakily and nodded. She swallowed hard. "I just need the money soon, please." Father Donald offered her a reassuring smile. "And you will have it," he said. Favor hesitated for another moment before turning toward the door. She reached for the handle, but before stepping out, she glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she slipped out of the room, shutting the door behind her. Father Donald sat still for a long moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Then, slowly, he exhaled. His fingers tapped against the desk, his mind already working through the next steps. Everything was falling into place. His ordination would proceed as planned. And Favor? Well, she would learn to be patient. Frank lay on his bed, staring at the neatly packed suitcase in the corner of his room. The excitement thrummed in his chest like a drumbeat, making it impossible to sleep. Dubai. It felt unreal. For so long he had dreamed of this moment, of leaving behind the small, suffocating town and stepping into a world of opportunity. He had pictured it all: the towering skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the life he would finally build for himself. And now, in just a few hours, it would no longer be a dream. He turned his head to glance at his phone, the bright numbers on the screen blinking back at him. 2:47 a.m., just a few more hours, and he would be on his way to Abuja. From there, he would board his flight to Dubai, and everything would change. A slow smile stretched across his lips. Father Donald had promised this would be his reward, a small price for betraying a friend. Frank sat up, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't guilt that kept him awake. No, he had long since buried any trace of that. What was done was done. Judith was in the past, a shadow in his story, and he had done what he had to do to secure his future. The thought settled in his mind like a stone. He exhaled, his eyes drifting back to his suitcase. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The journey to Abuja had been smooth at first. The bus hummed along the highway, the rhythmic movement lulling some of the passengers into sleep. Frank, however, was too wired to rest. He sat by the window watching the scenery blur past, his mind filled with the endless possibilities awaiting him. Dubai. The name alone carried a weight of success. He had spent hours scrolling through pictures on his phone, imagining himself there, walking along the marina, dressed in sharp suits, money in his pockets, power at his fingertips. This was his moment. He leaned back, letting the anticipation settle deep within him. Then, the bus lurched. At first, he thought it was just a pothole, but then came the screech of tires, the shouts of the driver, and then gunshots. Screams erupted. Passengers ducked, their bodies pressing into the seats, trembling hands covering their heads. Frank's breath caught in his throat. No, 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 this can't be happening. The doors were yanked open, and men in dark clothing flooded in, guns pointed at them. Their voices were sharp, their words cutting through the air like knives. Frank's heart pounded as they moved through the bus, scanning each passenger with precision. And then, one of them stopped in front of him. Frank barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed him, yanking him from his seat. Move! Panic exploded inside him. He thrashed, tried to pull away, but the grip was ironclad. He looked around wildly, expecting them to take others, to empty the bus and demand ransoms, but no. They only wanted him. Why only him? Then, as they dragged him toward a waiting vehicle, one of the men pulled out a phone, dialed a number, and then, "Hello, Father. We have him." The words sliced through Frank like a blade. His body went rigid. Father? His mind reeled, trying to process what he had just heard. Number no, no, no. It couldn't be. Maybe he misheard. Maybe it was another father, another priest. But then the man spoke again. "Father Donald, what should we do with him?" Frank's stomach twisted violently. It was him. It was him. His mouth went dry, his breath coming in the shallow gasps. Father Donald had set him up. The realization sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. Why? Hadn't he done everything the man asked? Hadn't he lied for him, betrayed his own friend, played his part like a fool? Hadn't Father Donald promised him a future? And now he was nothing more than a loose end to be tied up. Frank clenched his jaw as they shoved him into the back of another vehicle, his hands bound, his vision blurred with rage and fear. The car sped off into the unknown, taking him further from everything he knew, everything he had dreamed of. And in that moment, Frank realized something chilling. He had traded his soul for a future that was never meant to be his. The place they took him to was dark, the air thick with dust and sweat. They tied him down, the ropes biting into his skin. And then they argued. He could hear them, their voices rising and falling, tension thick between them. Something about money, something about a share. Then, "I gave him 5 million naira cash. Take out 3 million for me tomorrow. The rest, split it among yourselves." Frank's blood ran cold. He wasn't just a target, he was payment. They weren't just going to kill him, they were going to profit from his death. The argument grew heated, voices turned sharp, accusations flew, and then chaos erupted. Fists swung, bodies crashed against walls. And in that moment, his moment, Frank moved. His hands had been tied, but not tightly enough. With a sharp twist, he yanked free, lunging forward, grabbing at the nearest thing, a phone. The man who had been holding it didn't even notice, too busy fighting for his cut. Frank wasted no time. He ran. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. Then, a gunshot. Pain exploded in his leg, white-hot, searing. Frank stumbled, his body screaming in agony, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when he had finally seen the truth. Not when everything had been a lie. He pushed forward, forcing his body to move, ignoring the blood trailing behind him. He didn't know how far he ran, didn't know where he was going, but then, lights, a checkpoint, soldiers, salvation. His body collapsed before he could reach them, but his fingers fumbled with the phone, his vision blurring as he dialed. A number he hadn't called in years. It rang, once, twice, then. "Hello?" His mother's voice. Familiar. Warm. His throat closed. "Mama," he choked out. Then, before he could say more, everything faded to black. I knelt in the quiet corner of the chapel, my fingers moving numbly over the beads of my rosary. My lips trembled as I whispered each prayer, the words spilling from my mouth like a plea, a desperate cry for justice, for strength, for something, anything to remind me that I wasn't alone. That evening, as I sat outside staring at the fading sky, my grandmother's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "The man you tried to bring down will be ordained tomorrow." I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a twisted smirk tugging at her lips. Her words settled over me, cold and heavy. Father Donald. Ordained. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. My grandmother must have seen the way my face twisted in pain because she laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You thought you could ruin him, didn't you?" she sneered. "And yet look at you, abandoned, rejected, left to rot while he rises." I felt my breath hitch, my throat tightening as tears burned behind my eyes. But this couldn't be happening. After everything, after all the humiliation, the suffering, he was still winning. It felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs, the weight of her words pressing down on me. But then, a calmness settled over me. I placed a hand over my stomach, feeling the faint movement beneath my palm. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, I said, "My God is still alive. He will fight for me." My grandmother's eyes darkened, and then, before I could react, she grabbed a pocket of water from the ground and threw it at me. The coldness of it shocked my skin, but what burned more was the hatred behind it. "Foolish girl," she spat. "Your God has abandoned you." Her voice rang in my ears, but I refused to let her see my pain. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. Away from her cruelty. My feet pounded against the hard earth, my vision blurred by unshed tears. Then I felt it. The sharp, unforgiving edge of a stone beneath my foot. Pain exploded up my leg as I stumbled, my body lurching forward. And then, darkness. The first thing I felt was the cold. Then, a sharp burning pain in my abdomen. I gasped, my fingers grasping at the earth beneath me. Something warm trickled down my legs. Blood. A lot of blood. I heard a scream. It took me a moment to realize it was my grandmother. Her voice was distant, panicked. There were hands, many hands, grabbing me, lifting me. The world spun, my vision flickering in and out of focus. I tried to speak, to say something, but the pain stole my voice. I felt myself being carried, the sound of hurried footsteps, voices shouting for help. And then, the world faded again. The first thing I felt was emptiness. A deep, aching void inside me, one that stretched beyond the physical, beyond the pain, beyond the confusion that clouded my mind. I tried to move, but my body felt too heavy, as though I were being held down by something unseen. Then, voices, distant murmurs, footsteps, the beeping of a machine. Slowly, my eyelids fluttered open. White walls, a dim light flickering overhead. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled my nose. A hospital. I blinked, my mind struggling to piece together how I had gotten here. Then, a sharp pain stabbed through my abdomen. A gasp tore from my lips. Memories crashed into me all at once. The argument, the water, the fall, the blood, my baby. A strangled sob escaped me as I pressed a shaking hand to my stomach. It felt different. Too different. Something was missing. No, no, no. Panic surged through my veins. My breath quickened. My heart pounded. I tried to sit up, but my body protested, weak and aching. A figure moved beside me. I turned my head slowly, my vision still hazy, and saw my grandmother. She sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clasped together, fingers digging into her skin. For the first time since I had known her, she looked shaken. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. I already knew. Tears welled in my eyes as I turned back to the ceiling, swallowing the lump in my throat. It wasn't possible. I had felt my baby kicking just yesterday. I had whispered prayers over my stomach, promising to protect them, to love them no matter what. And now there was nothing. The door creaked open. A doctor stepped inside, his face unreadable. "She's awake," he said softly, as if I weren't even there. My grandmother nodded stiffly. The doctor hesitated, then turned his gaze to me. "Judith," he said gently, his voice filled with forced sympathy. "I'm so sorry, but we couldn't save the baby." The words hit me like a dagger to the chest. I felt them before I even processed them, like a knife slicing through my ribs, carving through flesh, leaving behind only a gaping wound. I sucked in a shaky breath, but it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough air in this room, wasn't enough air in the entire world to fill the emptiness inside me. My vision blurred. I barely registered the doctor murmuring something to my grandmother before stepping out, leaving us alone again. Silence stretched between us. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, my grandmother said, "It's over." I squeezed my eyes shut. Over. As if this was something that could be summed up in 2 words. As if this was just another inconvenience, something to move past, to forget. But how could I forget? How could I erase the memory of my baby's tiny kicks? The moments when I would lay my hands on my stomach and dream of a future that never came. A single tear slipped down my cheek. My grandmother sighed, shifting in her seat. "Rest," she said after a moment. "You'll need your strength." She stood up and left without another word. And I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much more of me could be taken before there was nothing left. Meanwhile, miles away, the church bells rang. The ordination had begun. The air inside the church was thick with incense, the scent swirling through the grand cathedral like a veil of unseen hands pressing down on my chest. Even miles away, lying weak and drained in my hospital bed, I could feel it. I could feel the weight of what was happening at that very moment. The moment that was supposed to be a glorious victory for Father Donald. A celebration, a grand ordination. The congregation had gathered in their finest garments, their faces glowing with reverence. The choir's voices soared in perfect harmony, singing praises, filling the sacred hall with melodies meant for the divine. Golden light streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating the altar where he stood, draped in his pristine vestments, his hands folded in a display of humility. Father Donald, the man they called a martyr, the man they defended, the man they worshipped. He stood before the bishop, a picture of solemnity, prepared to take his final vow, his moment of triumph, his moment of power, the moment the church would fully embrace the devil in disguise. Then, a scream, sharp, piercing. It shattered the sacred hymns, cutting through the ceremony like a blade through silk. The murmurs began immediately, heads turning, eyes widening in confusion. Then the scream came again, only this time it was clearer, closer. A woman pushing through the crowd, a woman whose face was twisted in a frenzy of emotion, anguish, desperation, fear, a woman who knew the truth, favor. She ran towards the altar, her steps frantic, her hands clutching at her own arms as though something unseen was forcing her forward. Her breath was ragged, her voice trembling, yet loud enough for the entire church to hear. "Stop, stop this!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Priests exchanged bewildered glances. The bishop paused, his hands still hovering over Father Donald's head. And Father Donald, his face paled. For the first time, his mask cracked. His fingers twitched. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He knew. He knew exactly why she was here. And he knew he couldn't stop her. Favor fell to her knees before the altar, sobbing uncontrollably. Her body convulsed as though something greater than her was working through her, pushing the truth out of her trembling lips. I can't hold it anymore, she wept. I have to say it. I have to confess. The entire church fell silent, a strange, eerie silence, like the hush before a violent storm. Then she spoke. Father Donald is a fraud, she cried, her voice breaking. He's not who you think he is. He did terrible things. To me, to Judith. At the mention of my name, I could almost feel the shift in the air, the way the churchgoers tensed, the way the whispers started, the way eyes darted toward Father Donald. But she wasn't done. He drugged me, she continued, her hands gripping at her chest, as if trying to claw the memory out of herself. That day, the day Judith and I went to see him, he offered us drinks. I took the one meant for her. I thought it was harmless. I didn't know. Her voice broke into another sob. I woke up and he was there, on top of me. A collective gasp swept through the church. The altar trembled with the weight of her words. The bishop staggered back. The priests looked at one another in disbelief. And Father Donald? He didn't move. He couldn't move. His body was rigid, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Because he knew this was only the beginning. Favor's voice rose again, stronger now, as though the invisible force compelling her refused to let her stop. He paid me, she screamed. He paid me to betray Judith, to stand against her in front of the church council. He promised me money. He promised me comfort. He promised me everything if I just denied her. And I did it. I turned my back on my best friend for money. I ruined her life. Sobs racked her body, but she pushed through them. But that wasn't enough for him, she whispered, her voice trembling. He wanted more. And she shook her head violently, her hands clawing at her own hair. I let him use me. Tears streamed down her face. Over and over and over again, I let him use me. The weight of her words sent a ripple of horror through the crowd. People clutched their rosaries. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others simply stared, frozen, unable to comprehend the depth of betrayal unfolding before them. He told me to keep quiet, she continued. Told me he'd keep paying me, and I did. I kept my mouth shut. I spent his money. I lived in comfort while Judith suffered. Her voice cracked. But I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face. I kept feeling this presence. Her hands trembled violently. Something has been following me, tormenting me. I don't know if it's God. I don't know if it's Judith's spirit. But I know this. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I couldn't let this man stand at this altar and take vows before God when he is nothing but a monster. She lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes locking onto Father Donald's, and for the first time, the congregation turned their full attention to him. The whispers grew louder. The gasps turned to murmurs. The murmurs turned to accusations. Father Donald did not speak. His lips parted slightly as if searching for words. But there were none. No lies. No excuses. Nothing. Because he knew. He had been caught. And no amount of deception could save him now. The church felt suffocating. The air, once filled with the scent of burning incense and fresh flowers, now carried something heavier. Betrayal. The walls, once a place of refuge, seemed to be closing in, trapping every soul within them, forcing them to witness the truth. And then I saw him. Frank. His presence sent a ripple through the crowd. He wasn't the same Frank who had once walked with so much pride, the boy who laughed easily, who had once held my trust in the palm of his hands. No, that Frank was gone. This one was broken. His right leg was bandaged, his body frail, his hands gripping crutches as though they were the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Yet despite his wounds, despite his pain, his eyes burned with something fierce. He dragged himself forward, the heavy thud of his crutches hitting the marble floor, the only sound in the now silent church. The people parted, stepping away as if sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. Then he stopped, right before the altar, right before Father Donald, the man who had orchestrated everything, the man they had all trusted. "You tried to kill me." His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It carried the weight of truth, the weight of betrayal. Murmurs spread through the crowd, but Frank didn't waver. He reached into his pocket, his hands trembling as he pulled out something small and black. A phone, a lifeline to the truth. "I want you all to hear something." He tapped on the screen. The phone crackled, and then his voice, Father Donald's voice, cold, calculating, unmistakable. "Kill him on his way to Abuja. Make sure he doesn't make it." Gasps, screams, hands flying to mouths. Some people instinctively stepped away from Father Donald, as if he had suddenly become a curse, a disease, a monster. But Frank wasn't finished. The recording continued. The sound of another man, one of the kidnappers, asking for payment. And then, Father Donald's voice again. "I gave him 5 million naira. Take out 3 million and deposit it in my account tomorrow. The rest, share amongst yourselves. I don't care what happens to him. Just make sure he doesn't get to Dubai." The audio ended. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then the first shattered sob. I turned my gaze and saw them, my parents. My mother's hands covered her mouth, her entire body trembling, her eyes wide, not just in horror, but in guilt. My father. A man who had always been so sure, so firm, so unshakable, looked like a man who had just been stripped of everything, his fists clenched at his sides, his gaze locked onto the man he had once defended. And in that moment, I knew that every ounce of doubt they had ever held about me was gone. I knew that the weight of their guilt would consume them, because now they understood. Now they saw. They had abandoned their daughter. They had turned their backs on me for a man who had done all of this. My mother took a step back, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." As if denying it would somehow undo it, as if refusing to believe it would change what had already been done. But the truth was undeniable, and the truth had finally come screaming into the light. I stood there, unseen, as the weight of everything crashed down upon them. The church, once filled with celebration, now reeked of betrayal, grief, and horror. Frank's revelation had shattered everything the people had come to witness an ordination. Instead, they bore witness to evil unmasked. Father Donald, the man they had adored, defended, and revered, stood exposed. His sins stripped bare before the altar where he had once knelt in false humility. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she came. My grandmother. She burst through the doors, her wail slicing through the silence like a knife to the throat. Her frail body trembled, her wrapper barely holding onto her bony frame as she staggered forward. Her feet were bare, covered in dust, as if she had run all the way here. "Where is he?" she cried, her voice raw, broken. "Where is Judith's father?" My mother turned, eyes wide with confusion. "Mama?" she whispered. The murmurs in the church grew louder. People turned, watching, waiting. My grandmother's knees hit the floor. "Judith is dead." The words hung in the air. A single sentence, yet it silenced an entire church. My mother froze. Frank, still gripping his crutches, staggered backward. Favor, already on her knees in her own spiral of confession and regret, let out a choked gasp. And my father, the man who had refused to believe me, who had once thrown his trust so easily to another, stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his lips slightly parted, like a man who had just felt his soul leave his body. The church spun around them. I could feel it, the way the world collapsed beneath their feet, the weight of their choices, the weight of their failure. My grandmother held something in her trembling hands, a folded paper, a letter. She looked up at my father, her eyes filled with a grief so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. "She left this for you." Slowly, as if in a trance. My father stepped forward. His hands shook as he took it from her. For a moment he just stared at it, as if he was afraid of what it would say, as if he knew that whatever was written on that page would be his undoing. Then his fingers unfolded the letter, and he read, "Dear Church, I write this with a heart that no longer seeks justice nor revenge, only release. I was once one of you, a girl raised in faith, taught to believe that the church was a home, a refuge, a place where truth thrived and justice lived. I was taught that God sees all, that he does not forsake the innocent, that he does not let evil go unpunished. But I learned that men are not like God. I learned that the hands I trusted to bless me could also destroy me. I was betrayed by those I called friends, by those who stood before this altar and swore to serve God, not themselves, by my own family. I remember when the accusations first fell upon me. I remember the looks of disgust, the whispers, the judgment. She is a disgrace. She is a liar. She is an enemy of the church. I knelt before the same altar where Father Donald stands today, and I begged God to let the truth be known. But you did not want the truth. You wanted a villain, and so you made me one. Father Donald, the man you defended, the man you celebrated, was not who you thought he was. But deep down, maybe you always knew. Maybe you chose not to see, because it was easier to believe that a young girl, poor, voiceless, unwanted, was the sinner, rather than the man who wore a cassock and spoke of God. But one thing I have learned is this: truth does not die. You may bury it, you may silence it, you may crush it beneath the weight of your lies, but one day, the truth will find you, and when it does, it will demand to be heard. I wonder, does it feel heavy now? The weight of knowing that you stood on the wrong side, that you let the innocent suffer while the guilty thrived? Does it burn inside you? It should. Because this is the same fire that burned inside me every day as I carried the burden of your rejection. You pushed me out, left me to wander in a world that had no place for me. I lived in shadows, whispered my prayers through tears, and clutched my stomach as I felt my child, my only light, fade from within me. I called out for help. None of you answered. And now, I am gone. Not because God abandoned me, but because you did. You will weep for me now. I know you will. You will cry, you will mourn, you will say you regret it all. But I do not need your pity. I do not need your regrets. I needed your belief when I was still alive. I needed your hands to hold mine when I was slipping. I needed your voices to stand beside me, not against me. But you were silent. And silence, I have learned, is just another form of murder. To my mother, I loved you. Even when you turned your back, even when your eyes refused to see me, I still loved you. I waited for you to fight for me, but you never did. And now, as I stand before you, no longer flesh, no longer burdened by pain, I have only one thing left to say. You should have believed me. I have been sitting here for a long time, watching, waiting. From the moment they lowered my body into the ground, I have been here, unseen but ever present. The wind moves through the trees, whispering through the grass above my grave, carrying my story to those who will listen. And now they all know the truth. Father Donald, stripped of his priestly robes, shackled like the criminal he always was, will never see the outside of a prison again. He was always so careful, always so sure no one would ever catch him. But evil has a way of exposing itself, when it becomes too greedy. Frank, my friend, my brother in all but blood, paid the price for his betrayal. He stands now with only one leg, forever reminded of what his selfishness cost him. I have watched him struggle, seen the torment in his eyes. He wishes he could undo it all, but regret is a prison of its own. Favor, once so proud, so sure of herself, now sits in the emptiness she created. She betrayed me for money, for security, for a lie. And in the end, she lost everything. A womb that will never bear life, a heart that will never know peace. And my parents? Oh, how they weep. My mother clutches my letter to her chest, as if she can squeeze the life back into it, into me. My father no longer walks with pride, but with sorrow, his head bowed under the weight of all the times he should have believed me but didn't. They sit in silence together in their grief. I have watched them all, listening to their cries, feeling the pain that lingers in their souls. And I have hated them. I have hated them for every moment they let me suffer, for every time I begged for love and they turned away, for the life they stole from me, the child I never got to hold, the breath that was ripped from my lungs before I had a chance to live. But hate is heavy, and I am tired. The world has heard my story now. My name will not be forgotten. My truth will not be buried with me. And so, I release it all. I forgive you, all of you. Not because you deserve it, but because I do. I have sat here long enough. It is time to rest. Slowly I rise from my grave. The earth beneath me is soft, welcoming. The wind carries my whisper one last time before I close my eyes. And as I sink into the darkness, vanishing into the peace I have longed for, I know I am finally free. I finally rested in peace. The end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on the notification bell so you won't miss out on our latest stories.